Republicans are trying to block access to the voting booths again this year. No surprise there. But there's more to the story than just voter suppression. I have MichaelBurg with me to talk about that. Michael, the Supreme Court, the Republican majority Supreme Court right now, you know, the regular suspects, took away probably one of the most important ways to make sure that everybody can vote. This is old news, and that was, you know, to basically trample on the Civil Rights Act. So now what we have is it's taking off like crazy in the states where you have places like Wisconsin and Ohio and Florida saying, okay, it's a free-for-all, man. We're out here. We're going to do whatever we want. That free-for-all mentality in trying to say, we're simply going to keep you from voting, and there's nothing you can do now because the Supreme Court said that there's nothing you can do. That is the mentality out here right now, isn't it?
It is. And what really compounds the problem, though, Mike, is that, number one, is they're really trying to enrage and get their base out, the angry white man, to get out there and vote because their rights are being taken away by minorities, by giveaways. So they're really getting them really inflamed at the same time, doing everything they can to keep the people from voting. It's an amazing thing. They're passing laws. No weekend voting, no extended hours voting. The IDs, you have to have IDs. Poor people, minorities, they don't have IDs. It's really scary because it reminds me really of what Hitler did in the 30s.
Well, what you're talking about there, Mike, you hit an important point when you first started this conversation, and that is that hasn't the party gotten to the point, if you listen to what they're saying, I mean, you got Paul Ryan out there basically talking about how inner city people are worthless, lazy, worthless, taking care of the welfare, stealing from welfare. You have Rand Paul out there saying that it's the black man's fault that they're living in poverty. You even had a senator. You even had a senator just a couple of weeks ago come forward with the idea of saying that, you know what, in America, a business owner should be able to say to a black man, we won't serve you here. That's the status. Now, the reason I'm so captivated by the first statement that you made is, hasn't it gotten to the point where the white voter, according to the Republican mentality, is living dancing in a slow burning house? I mean, they're just out there. They understand demographics are shifting so crazily. So now, isn't their goal to squeeze every vote they can out of their diminishing minority?
Absolutely. And in fact, what they're doing is they're preying on the ignorance. We've talked about this many times, the ignorance and this idea. Food stamps, they're going after food stamps. These people are taking money out of your pocket. They're going after welfare. They're trying to light a fire to make them afraid that the society that they have grown accustomed to in the United States is going to be gone unless they go out and vote against all these people who want to give people rights.
No mention of the fact that we handed $3 trillion out to incompetent boobs on Wall Street who burned down the entire economy. No mention of that. That's corporate welfare. You see, that is true corporate welfare. That's big corporate welfare that never flows down to the bottom. But, Mike, you started with this point, and I want to work with it a little bit more because I think it's an important point. Hasn't the Republican Party gotten to the point to where they're saying, look, it's almost a South African mentality. In South Africa, they did a lot of research, and they said, how is it that we can have such a small minority gain and keep control in South Africa when the ratio is 1 to 10,000? You know, one white person for 10,000 Africans. How do we do that? And they figured out that they scare that minority, the whites, they infuriate the minority, they arm the minority, they make that minority militant. And when you talked about Berlin in 1933, that is exactly how you had the rise of fascism there. And you typically see that all the time you have fascism, a very small core of people that are so angry and they're so infuriated that they do rise to the occasion.
And in this country, what's going on is at the same time they're doing that, they're also intimidating, legally and illegally, keeping the poor, the minorities, from voting. they're stopping them voting. And so it's a two-step process. Let's get our vote out. Let's scare them. Let's squeeze every vote we can out of our small minority. And yet let's intimidate and pass laws to stop the majority from voting. It is fascism. It's not like it. It is fascism right here in the United States of America.
Well, in Wisconsin, for example, talk about the specifics you want to talk about here. Wisconsin, you had, of course, Scott Walker, no surprise here, but the Republican-controlled Wisconsin Senate scrapped weekend voting because they knew that the numbers of 500,000 people in Wisconsin voted on weekends, and they understood the vast majority of those people, 70%, were minority. They were people that would have voted for Democrats, so they scrapped the system. And I thought it was really interesting, the argument that they made. I mean, think about this argument, Mike. You had the people who came forward with this bill to scrap weekend voting saying, it's just not fair that people in one part of the state are voting on weekends and people watching television are seeing that and they're not voting too. It was such a crazy argument that they said it was confusing to the people that were watching other people vote, that those people were just too stupid to understand it's weekend voting, and that the people who were watching the weekend voters saying, well, it's not fair to me because I can't vote on weekends. Those are the kinds of ridiculous arguments we're hearing coming out of Wisconsin and Scott Walker right now.
We are, and what he was talking about is the minority vote coming out of Milwaukee, people who had to work all week, who couldn't vote during the week. And he's saying it was unfair to the people out in the farming area and the more conservative area where there's little population. It was nothing more than a false statement to try to keep the minorities and keep the majority, from voting. And not only there, but in Ohio, voter IDs.
Anywhere there's a Republican governor and a Republican Senate, we're seeing this, aren't we?
Right, and we have lawsuits all over the place. There's lawsuits to try to stop people from doing what they're doing in Texas, in Louisiana, in Alaska, in Montana. It's going on everywhere where there's a Republican governor. They're doing everything they can to keep the people from being able to get out and vote, which is the basics of this country. It's unbelievable.
So if I listen to your theory, I think you started this by, it's a two-tier theory.
Absolutely.
A, incite the small minority, the frail, stale, pale, old folks, old men who are afraid of everything. I guess there's something to getting so damn old you just get afraid of everything. But scare them to death, and because they are your base. Solidify and squeeze everything you can out of them. And then on the other side, your theory is close the polls to where the people who want to vote can't even get the chance to vote.
Absolutely.
How about gerrymandering, Mike? Isn't that part of it? Right there in Colorado, isn't that part of what you faced in Colorado, the gerrymandering?
Well, they've been gerrymandering for a long time trying to hold on to that, but because, as what you mentioned earlier, was the changing demographics of the population, that's not going to last forever. And so what they're doing now is intimidation and lying about what's going on here to incite the small, old, angry, rich men, white men, to come out and make sure everybody votes. I was sitting in a restaurant last night where a grandfather was just screaming at his granddaughter on these exact issues, and she was probably 14 years old, about how the giveaways and everything, and she was trying to stand up to him. And boy, her mother and everything just slapped her down. I want to go over and pat her on the back, but it's going on every day. We see it every day.
Yeah. The generational issue, that's just part of it. But back to the voting, here's what's so interesting. The majority of Americans, even today, believe that it's okay to have a voting ID card. They say, yeah, there's no problem with that. But then the 70% of them say, at the same time, do not interfere with the right to vote.
Right. That's in Iowa. In Des Moines Register, they did in Iowa, which is not the most liberal place in the world, 71%, 2/3 of Republicans said every voter should have the right to vote. And yet we're seeing these sort of things going on.
Mike, I believe in that same study you were talking about, there were some interesting numbers. The majority of people still believe that an ID card is a good idea, but at the same time, they say that we ought to be able to register to vote on the same day. They say that there ought to be support for expanding early voting. They say, as a matter of fact, the vast majority say that there ought to be a system where people are automatically registered to vote at 18. So that study tells me people believe in the idea and the importance of voting. I mean, isn't that the way you read this?
I do, but remember, it's that small minority that's out there trying to close the loop to try to gain and continue to gain power. I think generally most of the population agree with what the study is, which is that everyone should have the right to vote, but that doesn't mean they're still not going to do what we saw in South Africa or what they did in Nazi Germany. It's going to happen. It's happening right now, and I think people need to be aware of it.
So your point, Mike, is a strong, fearful, frenzied minority can certainly maintain control in this country, as we have seen with this Republican-held House of Representatives.
Right.
So anyway, yeah. Mike Burg, as usual, thank you. Very informative, and it's something that if people aren't paying attention to, they're doing it at their own peril. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mike.